Good morning, Art History 2. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Today I'm coming to you from Rome and the Vatican, and one of the greatest accomplishments in human history in terms of the arts, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. A real masterpiece, tour de force of what the human condition and creativity can enable. Today we'll be talking about one of the greatest artists ever, as you can see, the genius of Michelangelo di Buonarroti from 1475 to about 1564. Just a remarkable kind of accomplishment what he's able to do. Now, he is probably the greatest artist that has ever lived. When we do surveys, he generally comes in as the greatest artist ever. This is not to say that Leonardo da Vinci is any less as an artist or later on Picasso, but particularly for the Leonardo during the Renaissance period, which we just covered, which is also in the High Renaissance. So the High Renaissance really are our three Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Leonardo da Vinci, we have Michelangelo Buonarroti, and Raphael. Those three individuals really highlight what the Renaissance is all about that perfection of classicism and humanism and empiricism, spectacular achievements to try to create a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, almost like you're looking through a window like a three-dimensional film. They're pretty cool. So get ready, put on those glasses, and get ready to look at one of the coolest artists in the history of the world. Now, Michelangelo believes himself to be a sculptor, and he does not want to be called an artist, but rather a sculptor. So the fact that he does architecture, painting, poet, and is probably the greatest artist of the Renaissance and of the entire world is pretty remarkable. One of his poems is below that I'll read to you in the lower left-hand corner, and he is also the architect of St. Peter's Cathedral, which is, I'm currently hiding, right there. That dome is actually Michelangelo's design, and here you see the beautiful interior design by Michelangelo. And so here is his poetry on divinity and beauty together. He who had made everything made every part, and then from everything he chose the fairest. So let us here look at his very greatest. And now he has done so with his sacred heart. And of course, referencing to God and the acts of creation that takes place, but also God as the artist, as Michelangelo believes his hands are divinely inspired. Now, Michelangelo, as soon as I lower this, remember the boot in the world history, you look at this tiny little piece and everything that's come out of it when we talk about Roman history, we're going to talk about Renaissance, and then later on during neoclassicism and romanticism. A number of different major events are going to be centered here and in France within the art world, on this little tiny spit of land called Italy, the boot. When we look at Michelangelo's travels, Michelangelo spends most of his life, his early life is actually spent in Florence, where he is born. He's born in a tiny little town outside of Florence called Caprese, and spends a lot of his time in Florence working for the Medici family. Well, the Medicis are also going to become the popes, and when he does, he's going to spend the rest of his life, his adult life, almost exclusively working in Rome for the Pope, because he is the Pope's right-hand man in terms of sculpture, but then later on, when he's forced to do painting as well. So here's a video that explains a little bit, at least the introductory level, on who is Michelangelo.
Even though the Mona Lisa may be the most famous artwork in the world, I would argue this bit of painting would be a close second. You've got to check this out. Support provided by the Glick Fund, a CICF fund focused on inspiring philanthropy. Additional support provided by the Crystal DeHaan Family Foundation in honor of the children and families of Crystal House. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, we'll just call him Michelangelo, was born March 6, 1475 in Caprese, Italy. Buongiorno, or whatever. Yeah, he wasn't always the happiest artist, but we'll get back to that later. Michelangelo had 4 brothers, and his father was a magistrate, and his mother stayed at home with the kids. Now, when Michelangelo was an infant, she became pretty sick. In fact, Michelangelo ended up having to have a wet nurse, so he ended up living with a family of stonecutters. Interestingly, Michelangelo said it was because of this stonecutter wet nurse that he drank in the hammer and chisel. Yeah, not too sure about that one. By the way, did you know Michelangelo didn't want to be known as a painter? In fact, he would probably be insulted if you first referred to him as a painter and not a sculptor. Seriously, you did not just refer to me as painter, did you? Like many 16-year-olds, Michelangelo didn't really care for school, so he often would skip class and head to a nearby church to watch the painters. His family detested art and felt like he was a disgrace to the family. It was definitely not a suitable profession for a man. I think once Michelangelo started to make a name for himself as an artist, he loved to remind everybody back home. You can tell since he would always sign his letters home with Michelangelo, sculptor in Rome. That's right, and don't you forget about it. After realizing that Michelangelo had some artistic talent, his dad encouraged him to find an apprenticeship where he could learn more about art. He went from a painter's workshop to then studying within a powerful, rich, elite family within Florence, the Medici family. Did I mention they were the rulers of Florence? Yeah, they were. Working with this family gave him special privileges. One of those was being able to study dead bodies at the church waiting to be buried. This fueled his passion to understand human anatomy, and unfortunately, the stench and nastiness of the experience started to make him sick. Enough of that. Just a few short years later, when Michelangelo was only 25 years old, it was apparent he had a black belt in sculpture. After relocating to Rome, one of the cardinals within the Catholic Church commissioned him to create a sculpture. Michelangelo, being pretty cocky at this time, said, "It will be the most beautiful work in marble Rome has ever seen." A bit confident, right? Actually, it's this sculpture, La Pieta. Have you ever seen this one before? You bet you have. Check it out. Michelangelo sculpted this from a single piece of marble stone. What amazes me is it only took him 1 year to complete this 6-foot by 6-foot sculpture. Having an idea what the title means? Well, Pieta simply means pity or compassion, which makes sense considering the subject being Christ and his mother Mary. So you're probably asking yourself, what makes this sculpture so incredible? Let me explain. Check out the details in the folds and the ribs and muscles on the body. All this movement these details create. Trying to sculpt these details was incredibly hard. And trust me, people knew it, which is why many pilgrims would come to Rome just to see this sculpture. After returning to Rome, he hears about a sculpture that 2 other artists had abandoned because it was too difficult. Fueled with confidence from La Pieta, he takes over the job. David took 3 years to sculpt, probably due to its size of 17 feet. David quickly becomes the pride of Florence, and they even nicknamed it the Giant. After Michelangelo finishes this sculpture, his fame starts to build. In fact, word got around to the Pope, Pope Julius II. Immediately, Pope Julius commissions Michelangelo to create his tomb. This was huge for Michelangelo, especially since all he wanted to do was sculpt. And designing the tomb for the Pope was a huge honor. Michelangelo is so pumped to get going, he starts gathering a team, pouring the stone needed, and working out his idea. Of course, right in the middle of this, the Pope turns his attention and funding to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, which was falling apart. You have to keep in mind that Rome has basically turned into a cow pasture at this point, and the Pope wants to return Rome back to its powerful roots. A very Renaissance idea, I might add. Needless to say, he is super frustrated with the Pope, and when he wouldn't pay Michelangelo back for the stone he bought, he heads back to Florence, vowing never to return to Rome. That is until the Pope sends him a request. Have any idea what he's about to ask him to do? That's right, grab your paintbrush and get back to Rome and paint the Sistine Chapel. Let me tell you his response to the Pope. "I do not wish to attend to anything about the tomb and not the painting." Believe it or not, no one wanted to paint the Sistine Chapel. This wasn't just about the painting process. This also had to do with the chapel itself. Let me school you for a minute. The Sistine Chapel was built in 1477 and was designed to the same biblical proportions as the Temple of Solomon, which made it a fortress. The walls at the base are 10 feet thick, arrow slits added around the outside, and they even added special holes to pour boiling oil out of them. Pretty crazy. I bet you didn't know this, but the chapel had been painted before by a team of artists with 32 popes painted around the room, and then a blue field of stars was added to the ceiling. However, not even 21 years after the construction, cracks start to appear in the vault. To stop this from getting worse, in 1504, they placed huge iron rods underneath the floor. Of course, now we have a major problem. The ceiling and the walls must be repaired. After putting some of the Pope's muscle on Michelangelo, he told him he could only work on the tomb if he painted the Sistine Chapel. He reluctantly agrees. Be sure to check out Part 2, Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, and PJ2, which will be releasing soon.
And so, as the video talks about, one of his first sculptures, imagine this. This is basically his master's thesis when he comes out from his Bachelor's of Fine Arts and his Master's of Fine Art from the workshop, is the Pietà, considered one of the most beautiful sculptures, and the textural quality is as good as you will ever see in art anywhere ever. It is actually in the Vatican. So when you walk into the Vatican, here, me and my little guys, when we went in, you'll note they're pointing right over to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. So even though you have all this gold in this beautiful church when you walk in to St. Peter's, where the Pope actually lives, works, prays, your attention naturally is drawn over towards the Michelangelo because it is astonishing. It's raised up on a pedestal. And one of the amazing things about this particular artwork is no matter when you go there, you will see people probably kneeling and crying. Because of Christians that are actually there, this is one of the most holy spots, if not the third or fourth most holy spot in all of Roman Catholic Christendom. And partly is because of the Pope, but partly because of the sculptures and the artwork behind me of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo himself. And if you really look at it, you have about a very young Virgin Mary, about the time and about the age she would have had or been when she gave birth to the Christ child. And so, no, Jesus here is roughly a 32, a 34-year-old man after he's been crucified. So imagine the power of a mother either envisioning the death of her own child after miserable suffering at the end, or the actual body itself. Note, she doesn't cry. She's really kind of reserved and calm, almost as if she's relieved that the torture of her only begotten son is over. Beautiful folds that show up. And you will note it has everything that we want to see from the Renaissance, and it really does perfect it. It has this idea, this beautiful empiricism about how life, emotion, seniority really shows up. The one thing about it that's off by empiricism is that the body in the lap of Jesus or of the Virgin Mary is much too large, but that's actually just form a support of the very languid body of Jesus that happens to be here. No, Jesus is no longer suffering. There's no blood, there's no torture, there's no rips in the body. So it does show the beautiful aspect. The only thing that you see are the stigmata, these holes from supposedly where the cross went in, even though they would have been higher up in real life. So you have this beautiful Pietà done by a 24, and by the time he finishes, a 25-year-old man. It's remarkable. Now, one day Michelangelo is interested in what the reception is into the artwork after it's been installed in the Vatican. And he walks in and he hears some individuals talking, saying, I wonder who made this. This is a spectacular sculpture. And Michelangelo, being a little bit full of himself and knowing he's just created one of the world's greatest kind of art or sculptural monuments ever, decides he's going to sneak in at night and he's going to climb on the top of the Virgin Mary and specifically lean over Jesus and actually chisel in his name. Who made this? Michelangelo da Buonarroti. And so that's why we have Michelangelo da Buonarroti right across the Virgin Mary's breast. As well, it's also inscribed beneath in the unfinished rock down here to look like we're at an outdoor setting. Michelangelo thoroughly believed in the idea of him being a sculptor, and specifically in the idea that it was his job to free the sculpture from the rock, which he thought was already embedded within it. And it was his job to free it. And so here's how he would actually talk to his marble when he showed up. He would literally talk to his marble and tell the marble what he was going to do, and the figure inside. Good morning, Virgin. I'm going to free you today and help you breathe from that rock. Michelangelo actually talks to the rock. That's how he gets psyched up, pumped, or that's how he actually envisions the sculpture inside. So Michelangelo's method, he really did use geometry, as we can see here, geometry to zero in on the very main India on the inside or area on the torso, the face, the hands, the feet, and the feet were always saved for last. but note how he actually chiseled out to get to the torso rather than working specifically down or roughing out the entire shape. He goes piece by piece, and he relies on little models that he actually uses in order to keep everything in proportion, particularly with the beautiful bending moves that happen. His inspiration for this lovely image is Laocoon and his two sons, the overly expressionist image from the Hellenistic, the ancient Greek. Remember, this is also the artwork that inspires him to become an artist. He's so overwhelmed by trying to get that emotional detail. And you can see not just the languid pose, but the beautiful curves of the body, the rib cage, very much like you're seeing in Laocoon and his two sons. It's a spectacular sculpture, both of them. Now, later on, the Pietà actually gets attacked.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 21st of May 1972, Hungarian-born geologist Laszlo Toth attacked and seriously damaged Michelangelo's Pietà statue with a hammer. The Pietà is a marble sculpture that was created by Michelangelo between 1498 and 1499. It depicts the body of Jesus lying on his mother Mary's lap shortly after he was taken down from the cross, and is celebrated as one of the greatest pieces of Renaissance sculpture due to its balance of classical beauty and naturalism. Notably, the Pietà is also the only piece that Michelangelo ever signed. Laszlo Toth graduated from a Hungarian university with a degree in geology, after which he spent a number of years in Australia. He moved to Italy in June 1971, where he wrote a number of letters to Pope Paul VI in an attempt to meet him. A man who shared a room in a hostel with Toth later claimed he had found his constant reading of the Bible unusual. Toth unleashed his act of vandalism on the Pietà on Pentecost Sunday. He entered St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City as part of the crowd attending Mass, at which point he jumped over an altar rail in the chapel that housed the statue. He then set about attacking the huge marble sculpture with a geologist's hammer while shouting, "I am Jesus Christ, I have risen from the dead." Toth struck the statue 15 times before he was wrestled to the ground by bystanders, but his attack severed Mary's arm at the elbow, removed part of her nose, and damaged one of her eyelids. The attack also caused over 100 marble fragments to be strewn over the floor, some of which were taken by the crowd and never returned. The statue was later successfully repaired, while Toth was found to be insane and was committed to an Italian psychiatric hospital for 2 years.
And so we have to be wary when we actually look at these sculptures. And that's why today, because there's been so much vandalism on various sculptures for various different reasons, some as political commentary, some as individuals who now no longer like that religion, some who find the religion profane. I mean, one of the interesting things, if you go into the Vatican itself, before we look at the David, if you walk into the Vatican yourself, you'll notice a lot of women's breasts and male penises have been cut off. And that was actually by either later on the Romans or more likely by Christian popes and high-ranking figures as being profane because they were trying to cover up the nudity that was considered only allowed in the Garden of Eden. So even the popes have been involved with this process. Now, when we look at Italian Renaissance art aesthetics, the sculpture that might be the pinnacle of the sculpture during the time period is Michelangelo's David from 1501. He's doing it. It takes him a couple of years to do it, 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. So he's doing this when he's 26 years old. As the video before told us, this is a piece of marble that's remarkable because 2 other professional sculptors had abandoned it as being bad marble, that the fracture lines would not allow you to cut it. So he was already working with a piece of marble that already had a form roughly carved out that he had to put the David in. And so you'll note the perfection as we go through. The place where this is meant to be is a symbol for all of Florence. So it's out the Piazza della Signoria, which basically was the courthouse, and basically where the council elders would meet. You can see here it is a gigantic, and even if I move myself out of the way here, you can see there, you can even see the white sculpture. It ends up being about 17 to 18 feet tall. It's enormous, and so you can see across the square. It's raised up about 5 feet in the air. So even if you are in a large mass around here, you can still see the David. And remember, the story of David is exactly that. Why would Florence want to beat it or have it created? It's because they beat the great military superpower in the region in Tuscany, at that time, Siena. And so, on some level, it was a mark of civic pride that came out. Because if you think about what is the biblical story of David, age, he's about 14. While he's on the battlefield, he's not a warrior. He's delivering food as basically a caterer to the warriors. The size difference, David is supposedly really small, barely hitting puberty. David is this 10-foot giant who's super powerful. Weapons, he basically has a rock and a little whip that actually throws out. And why is he allowed to fight? Well, the only remarkable reason is that they must have believed that the Christian God was there protecting him against the giant Goliath, who was a real military hero and would have wiped him out. Now, one of the things that challenges we talked about, if you look at King David, Jesus Christ from Virgin Mary actually comes down through the line of David. And so it is Christ's great, 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 great ancestor that we're talking about. And so even the nudity poses some problems here because it is one of Christ's relatives. If we look at the changing then that's happened, going all the way back to spear bearer, note, compare and contrast, and in this case, I'm going to drop myself out of the way. Compare and contrast now the differences that show up between early Renaissance and high Renaissance. And that's largely what you're looking at here. So these are both David and Goliath sculpture, where we have David. This one is by Donatello, 1440. Remember, that's the one that the Medici commissioned. That was also for another battle over Siena, but it's got this homoerotic kind of feel with that feather coming up versus Michelangelo. If you really do compare them, which one is close to the biblical story and which one is closer to the hero that you would want out fighting for you? And clearly, this is the hero. And this is the 14-year-old boy who doesn't know what he's doing, and yet somehow miraculously is able to, even with his giant own sword that he can barely hold up. Now, the challenge for all of us, and this is what we're going to be talking about in class, is which one of these is the best representation of classical art. Remember, classical art is supposed to be about balance, calm, and perfection. And so if you start to compare these, balance, calm, and perfection, there is a balance and a calm. And remember what we talked about this, the model of male gender roles still established in every kind of capacity. But if you really do compare it, male pecs generally don't look like that. They look much more like this for someone who's developing. Even the striations that show up between here. He has such a knack for studying anatomy that it's remarkable that this is probably, ironically, even though it's done during the Renaissance, the best classical sculpture from the ancient Greco-Roman world, even over Polykleitos, which is a spectacular sculpture and so far ahead of anything else. But look at even how the contrapposto and that legs extending out with the toe ready for action. It's just a more dynamic pose. It really is a spectacular achievement. Michelangelo is huge, and so when they go to clean it, here's what they have to do. It's up on scaffolding, so you can see the size of individuals. You're basically up to his kneecap, and then his belly, and then up by the head to cleaning up here. He is absolutely considered to have the best butt in art. I actually have a bathroom reader book for when you're in the bathroom, like people sometimes take the newspapers. That's the best butt in art, and in that book, by far, this is the #1 butt in art. It's spectacular. What we said when me and my kids were there is from a Jewish phrase, is a mighty fine chuckus, the best butt in art. The nudity was an issue, and so they covered it up. It was actually censored all the way up until 1969, when they removed the fig leaves from the private part of Michelangelo, David, and actually for cleaning, and they decided that it was okay in 1969, hundreds of years afterward, to show David naked. like Michelangelo would have wanted during the Renaissance. They asked Michelangelo to put on the fig leaves after he had finished the sculpture, and he refused. So another artist whose name I do not know, we had to put them on. Now, Michelangelo has this myth around him. So here's one of the really interesting things. I mentioned before that one artwork or one way that you can make art is actually copying the masters. And if you get really good with copying the masters, you might even. And so when we look at this and kind of the spoofs and what comes out of it, Michelangelo's David is known everywhere, whether it's from SpongeBob to a McDonald's kind of spoof and parody that shows up. It's one of the most spoofed artworks on the planet. In Chicago, there is these large scale things that often have faces with names out. And so for Art Week, they actually put up different artworks in different capacities. So here you could be peed on by Michelangelo. And lastly, the David from Saturday Night Live. So there's the building that I was in front of as well.
This is so exciting!
Hey, quite a turnout.
And so making fun of the penis size in the modern day world.
Civilization is down in its accomplishments in the arts. They are the greatest artwork of all time. I'm Morgan Freeman.
Well, thank you, Morgan Freeman. As we talked about, this is an artwork that changed the world. It's the greatest individual artwork in history. And there's some questions because other people will throw up other things. Maybe it's the Mona Lisa. But if you think about this, is the largest fresco that had ever been done up until we had a group of individuals all working together by a single individual. It's a spectacular achievement. It takes somewhere around 4 to 5 years to make this. And this is with him working almost 7 days a week, lying on his back, cramped up conditions, standing up in very uncomfortable position, basically 60 feet in the air. Now, first off, it's the Sistine Chapel. It is named for Pope Sixtus down here. It is actually not the 16th chapel. So there are not 15 other chapels around here. It is actually the Sistine Chapel. So let's make sure we get that right. The Sistine Chapel is modeled after Giotto's Arena Chapel, which we saw as Art History 1, which supposedly tells the stories of the Virgin Mary, her parents, the life of Jesus, and the life of the afterlife of Jesus that shows up here with the Last Judgment. And so what we are ultimately seeing then is a representation of, this was kind of the New Testament. This is the corresponding Old Testament image till we get to the Last Judgment. And so the insignificant exterior here looks like this. Note the Sistine Chapel. This is the Scrovani Chapel, the Giotto's Arena Chapel. This is the Sistine Chapel. The insignificant exterior had a jewel-like interior, almost like a beautiful illuminated manuscript that glows when you open it. Michelangelo was given fairly good free reign to paint what he wanted from the Old Testament. We'll look at his contract, which is interesting to look at from before, and you'll note that the way that Michelangelo broke it down is in a series of trinities. So 3 sets of 3 for 9 major paintings. And so you can see it goes from the story of Noah to the creation of Adam and Eve, to the idea of the creation in the very earliest of Genesis, of God's creation. And so when you walk in, you actually walk into this area, or I'm sorry, you walk into this area, so you see Christian heritage from the Genesis and Exodus almost in reverse order. And the Pope prays right here, all at the end, so the altar is right there. Now, one of the things that shows up is that there is a very unusual central image. The central image we often think is Adam creating, or God creating Adam. And that's just not the case. The central image, ironically, is God creating Eve. So if you look, there's 4 major images in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then the 5th one is Eve. Note there's 4 major images afterwards. So we've got to talk about why would Eve be the most important part here that shows up. This is the Pope's private chapel. And there are different references, but we do believe Michelangelo made this on a large scaffolding, both standing and sitting down and having to lean over. And so he was pretty uncomfortable for such a large scale. This fresco is 10,000 square feet. Now, the way that he had to do it is actually based upon the creation of what's called buon fresco. or true fresco. It's one of the most difficult painting techniques because you have to create a plaster wall. While the plaster is still wet, you texture the wall. You cover it with what you're going to do in a day's work with wet lime, and then you have to stamp the outline. So basically, the cartoon is going to be invented here, or I should say, not invented here, but popularized here. And then you can only work on the area that is still wet because once it dries, it becomes part of the wall itself. So if you don't finish in a day's outline, you scrape off and begin the same process over tomorrow. So here's how Blaine fresco actually works if you're interested.
It's known that its basic approach was a standard technique called buon fresco, which is still taught at places like this international conservation organization in Rome. The chief conservator is Paul Schwarzbaum, now with the Guggenheim Museum. He explains what has been learned from the restoration about Michelangelo's technique.
We're going to try and make a reproduction, if you will, to recreate the working technique of Michelangelo, the way he painted the frescoes in the Sistine ceiling. We're going to use the same materials, and we're going to try as best we can to, not Michelangelo, but to recreate his working technique. The materials that you see on the floor, we know from analysis, these are the materials that Michelangelo used to make his plaster.
The plaster is made from lime, water, and a brown volcanic ash called pozzolana. These are mixed into a smooth violet-colored paste. The plaster is applied to a surface prepared the day before called the oricio. This fresh, wet layer, the intonaco, is applied just before painting.
The word fresco in Italian means fresh. And what it means is that we're painting on the fresh plaster. The painter was obliged to work before the plaster dried. Now, this means that the plaster could only be applied little by little as the painter worked in terms of what he thought he might finish in a day or before lunch or what have you. There's a word in Italian which is called the giornata. We know from cleaning of the Sistine that colors are very, very bright, and Michelangelo wanted these bright colors. To do that, we see that in certain areas he put on, at the very end, just before he painted, a very bright white, more white, let's say, very, very, very thin layer of preparation, but very rich in lime, very thin. It would be a millimeter or two thick, what he's putting on now, like a sheet of paper.
That helps the light shine through the paint and then shoot back.
The design is transferred using cartoons, drawings on paper. The contours of the figure are incised into the wet plaster, sometimes using a piece of wood. A different technique is used to outline the details around the face.
The other technique is called spolvero in Italian, and probably called a pouncing technique in English. We make a series of small holes along the lines in certain very key points. Michelangelo, we see, did the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the throat. And then it takes a little sack of charcoal or some powdered pigment. And then you'll see the pigment goes through the holes.
And that's how he was able to keep everything in proportion. So he's inventing basically this new way of doing it.
Take it off. You see, that would be how Michelangelo transferred his design. And with that, it gives you a base for painting.
Michelangelo mixed ground pigments with water. He used just 7 colors derived from minerals found in earthen clays. For his greens, he used green earth, ochres for his yellows and reds, and cobalt or lapis lazuli for the blues. When Michelangelo applied the colors to the wall, they had a translucent quality, like watercolor. But as the plaster dried, a process called carbonation took place. Carbon dioxide in the air combined with the lime in the plaster to form a hardened rock-like surface of calcium carbonate. As a result of this process, the pigment particles were cemented in place, becoming a part of the wall.
The standard fresco technique is a rather stable technique. When it's done well, it lasts thousands of years. We have Roman frescoes that are close to 2,000 years old.
But did Michelangelo vary the standard technique in any way, embellish it perhaps by adding any other layers of paint or blue varnish to the surface of the fresco? Unfortunately, there is no complete record of Michelangelo's working technique. In letters to his family, he...
And so when we look at Michelangelo, he's basically doing the traditional style as we listen to Gregorian chants that are basically going on. And this is what it would have been sung while Michelangelo was painting. Note, the underneath here is actually one of the images of the cartoon that he had to try to figure out how to keep everything in proportion. Because if you look at these individual squares, this is you looking up from the ground. Each one of these is 14 feet across. So we're talking about an enormous scale that we're working on. The word cartoon or cartoony actually means an original drawing or sketch in Italian. And that's where the word comes from. It was so popularized because people wanted to have a piece of this remarkable feature that they moved on and continued on. Wanted to buy it as tourists when they went to this. And so here is the original sketch of just one of the Sibyls. Initially, if you see anything written about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel before about 1980 and was cleaned, note that this is what it was pre-cleaning. Here's what it looks like today. And so that color is so vibrant that we've had to re-change the way that we think about Michelangelo because of the coloration that came out. So we're relating God's prophecy here. That's what we're looking at. That's what the Sibyls do. Sibyls basically foretell the coming of Christian stories. And I'm going to pause out of this for a moment just to make sure that we don't listen to music the entire presentation. And then I'll pop back. There we go. All right. Today, this place has become so powerful. This is actually where we have the papal elections. So when the Pope passes on and we need a new Pope, we do a thing called conclave, the papal election, where we have the cardinals come from all over the planet. You might have seen this in a few movies. Most recently, the Da Vinci Code does this, where we bring those cardinals. They are locked in and food is passed in, so they have to make a decision. They make a decision that if the first time they vote, and there's a little burning area that shows up right here, that they actually, so that there's an election, they will actually all vote. And they mix this with the powder. If no new pope has been elected, they mix it with the black powder, and so black smoke comes up. If they have actually come to a consensus that there is a new pope, they will mix it with a white color, and the white color will come out. And then the new pope will actually be ordained and come out as the new pope, as a new elected pope from conclave. And this can take days. Now, during this time period, one of the things to consider, particularly as we look at Pope Julius II, and here's an image of him from a movie with Richard Burton, kind of the agony and the ecstasy about the creation of the Sistine Chapel. Here's an actual image of Pope Julius II. And here's Michelangelo's depiction of Julius II. Notice, putting him in hell for what he made Michelangelo do at the Sistine Chapel, who hated being a painter. Boys or popes behaving badly. Here's Pope Julius II's record. He is a warrior, fearsome pope, which is fun. We had a number of popes that were military heroes. He is the model actually for Machiavelli, that you need to be feared. You can't always be feared and loved. So we're talking about a pope here. He battles France out of Italy, which is one of his military victories. But he also is one of the individuals that very much promotes the idea of the sale of indulgences. It's a little piece of paper that you would pay in order to get out of sin, basically a get out of hell free card or get out of purgatory free card. And he starts really promoting the sales of indulgences because he is the pope that's trying to rebuild St. Peter's and make it gorgeous and beautiful and worthy of a world-class city as he rebuilds Rome. He's going to establish the Swiss Guard to protect the Pope almost as a military force, which still lasts today. He, unfortunately, is going to be the Pope also that gives Roman Catholic explorers that are going over, such as Columbus, which is a little bit earlier, but Magellan, Horta, De Sal. He's going to give them the right to proselytize Indians. And unfortunately, this is going to come to some dramatic conclusions, particularly with individuals like Hernan Cortez, when he comes over and basically conquers Mexico. He basically has free will to proselytize Indians and enslave them while he gives them the Christian message. So slavery is very much going to be used as a selling point for Christian, and we can use their bodies provided that, and there's the sell of their bodies and their children's bodies, provided that we're giving them teaching of Christianity. He is going to commission the Sistine Chapel. He is considered a weird title, the best of the worst popes. So he's considered one of the worst popes, but the best of them. So not horrific, not a genocidal maniac. His just ideas are very centered in his own age, which caused irreparable damage to people around the world. His nickname, because he was liked to be feared, and if you were one of his enemies, you'd probably call him El Terrible Papa, which is a name that he actually liked to be called, which means the terrible or the fearsome pope. And he believes that he is selected by God, not by cardinals, but by God to be the divine power on earth. Very similar to the way the ancient Romans and Greeks believed that they were chosen by their gods to be the leader on earth. The original Sistine Chapel ceiling is over on the left, which is basically a blue background with stars, and Michelangelo's conception of the Old Testament. It's on the right. And so there's a strange story that develops. Michelangelo, of course, not being a painter and being a sculptor, has no idea how to paint. He worked in a painting studio when he was growing up, before he moved on to a sculpture and artistic studio, where he really did prosper in both architecture, sculpture, three-dimensional media. The most famous painter of the day is going to be Raphael. So Raphael and Michelangelo, neither of them want this commission because they know being up 60 feet in the air, 10,000 square feet, it's an overwhelming commission. Yes, the Pope is going to pay you incredibly well to do it, but it's not worth the time, money, effort. In fact, Michelangelo, when he finishes painting in his young 30s, basically walks around with a gait in his walk, like a hunchback for the rest of his life. And he often hates and reflects back about how much he hates the Pope for making him do this. So there is a commission where artists from all over the world, all sorts of different artists, put in their best work and say, we want to work for the Pope. We want to do the Sistine Chapel in every kind of capacity. We want to be the artist that's known for all of eternity in the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo and Raphael, neither of them put in commissions. They don't want it. The Pope looks through it and he's wondering, why isn't Michelangelo and Raphael there? So he goes to each of those artists independently and makes them put in a commission. Michelangelo and Raphael both put in really crappy work. Neither of them want the commission. So they put in their worst work. The Pope knows this, comes back with them and says, no. I need you to put in your best work. So they are forced to resubmit. Michelangelo is furious. He really doesn't. He's down to one or two. And Raphael does something that's fairly shady, but brilliant at the same time period. What Raphael is going to decide to do is Raphael is going to take his lovely individual kind of talents and go talk to the Pope. And he goes talk to Julius II and says, Julius, I've got a proposal for you. Let Michelangelo, who's been working on the sculpture, wants to work on your sculpture, let him work on that while he's doing the Sistine Chapel or right afterward. In the meantime, I actually have these wonderful frescoes that I can actually do in your personal library. These beautiful paintings, they're closer to the ground. I'm the best painter in the world. That way you get both of us working for you at the same time. And Pope Julius II says that's a brilliant idea. So he goes to Michelangelo and he says, Michelangelo, I've decided that you are the best painter. And Michelangelo, remember, this is the individual who believes that Jesus and God chose them on earth. And so Michelangelo starts cursing out the Pope, you blah, 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 and blah, 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 like you see in modern day television, George Carlin episodes. He runs away to Florence and says he won't do it. But when he gets to Florence and tries to get some work from the Medici and other families, no one will hire them, knowing that the Pope is waiting for him to come back. And so, tail between his legs, Michelangelo is forced to come back and try to figure out how to make amends because he knows he's going to have to do this project. He knows it's going to take years. and he basically has to relearn how to do fresco paint. So here's the contract that Michelangelo signs on, and he's forced to sign on April 15th, 1507. And we'll come back and look at that, but I'll give you a chance to just read it over for a moment. And the second part that I'd like you to read of the contract. Note, when doing the contract, the Pope is set up and has every advantage, whereas the artist does not. The Pope basically gets to say what he likes, what he doesn't like. At any point, if he wants to make any changes to the creativity or the ideas of Michelangelo, he gets to make those changes. If Michelangelo decides not to finish it, if he gets upset with all the projects or any of the changes, he can walk off, but then he doesn't get paid for anything, including the part that he's already finished and any materials that he has to invest up front in order to make sure that the painting is gorgeous. And ultimately what Michelangelo to do is create one of the greatest architectural, most beautiful artworks in terms of making people want to be a better Christian. Michelangelo is going to hate the Roman Catholic Pope Julius II for this commission and making him doing it, and kind of fears him as well, but at the same time, he is a very devout Roman Catholic. And so you can see the witnesses here, which cannot be any good. It's Raphael who actually signed off on the deal, Raphael Verbino and Pope Julius II. So Michelangelo has to basically create a cartoon. He needs to create an idea of what he's going to do. And the first image, because it goes in reverse chronology when you walk in the room. So it goes from the first three are the Trinity of the drunkenness of Noah. Then we go the creation of man and woman. And then we go to Exodus. So we're going to walk on it in reverse order on how he finished it. If you look at this image, this is a separation of light and dark. The first image, basically the image almost at the very end, close to the lovely place where the Pope is actually going to do his personal prayers. And you'll say, here you have a superhero God wearing pink, separating out the light and the dark that shows up here. And so that's what we're looking at. So you can see them, they're almost like superhero figures. You'll know Jesus is ripped, or God is ripped, considering that he's probably 70 when you look at this. The real showstopper in that first section is this one. And I'll put myself out of the way for a moment. You'll notice, what's the message of this second scene in the Sistine Chapel? And you're right, look at this. It's the creation of the sun right in the middle. That powerful light, that source, that the part that's going to light up the world, right? Sunlight coming into a stained glass church makes it all beautiful. It's also the nighttime of the moon. And note, he's outstretched arms doing it with both. But what happens when God finishes this remarkable accomplishment? Oh, God whisks away. And so note, as God whisks away, here after the two accomplishments, here's the sun, here's the moon, he whisks away, his butt comes out. And you see the underpainting, and as you whip off. Now, back in Michelangelo's day, you were 60 feet beneath this. Note how the colors are so analogous, meaning so similar between what actually human flesh would be and this. So you would only see the outline of the butt at all, and you would just think it's a wrinkle. You actually wouldn't notice this. But you do really get a good image. Now, to show you kind of how upset Michelangelo and kind of off-kilter Michelangelo willing to challenge the Pope of Christianity during this time period, if you look where God's butt is, right over here, it's exactly above where the Pope is going to pray. And so it's great. He's basically telling the Pope to kiss my ass, or God is telling the Pope to kiss my ass for making Michelangelo do this. And that is right underneath here. Unfortunately, of course, Michelangelo was a little bit disingenuous because every Pope now has to do this today. So it's basically directly right ahead. It's a pretty funny little comment. Moving further along, we're going to get to the creation of Adam. Creation of Adam is remarkable, and that's because you have these gigantic figures. Look at Adam. Adam is ripped. It's as if he's a bodybuilder. And as we ask you here, how old is Adam here? You might say 25, 26. he's actually about 2 seconds old. Note, the divine spark without the touching has come together. Note, they're not touching. There's a separation, almost as if there's a divine spark that shows up. Adam lovingly and in contrapposto looks over at Father or at the Creator, and God himself looks longingly back. Note the eye contact just for that particular gesture, one of the most important gestures. We're going to have thousands of artists that take these hand gestures and use them for all sorts of different aspects. And remember, Adam is born into the Garden of Eden. Look at the Garden of Eden here. There is really nothing there. There's no tree of knowledge. There's no plants. There's no animals. It's kind of a desolate environment. The focus is completely on man and that we are created in God's image, just a younger version of God. Now, note God in the creation of Adam. He knows, because God knows everything within the Christian world, that there is going to be some sin that takes place that's going to knock Adam out of the Garden of Eden. And who's going to do that sin? Well, look at God's lovely elbow. God's elbow wraps around a child, which we'll see in a moment, and it wraps around this lovely figure here, who later on we're going to learn is Eve. So in God's mind, while he's flying up here, creating the earth, creating man, no, he's going to have to create a woman that's probably going to cause man to fall. Eve's getting blamed before she's even born. And that's what we're looking at in the creation of Adam. Now, as we look at the creation of Adam, note, in David earlier on, Michelangelo reproduced the classical ideal male of heroism, of gender, of spectacular kind of in shaping. Here, Michelangelo has grown real muscle. Michelangelo has hit the workout facilities. And because his penis is smaller, maybe Michelangelo's got on a little roids that show up with that roid. Huge musculature, even a smaller, unidentified penis. We really do get the heroic, modern ideal man that we see in superhero films today. It does not come out of Michelangelo's David. That's the rebirth of the classical model. Still in shape, fantastic, gym body. This is someone who's working out. Not just working out, but working out, lifting heavy weights to build up upper body strength. Now, during this time period in Rome, anatomy wasn't legal in Rome. It was legal by this time in Florence, but not in Rome. So when Michelangelo is in Rome and studying the human body and dissecting the human body, even if he's going to morgues to look at them and repulsed by the smell in morgues that show up in churches or for bubonic death or for anyone who's dying, it's not legal. And so if you note, the shape here of God, without question, is the shape of the human brain. There's no question. In fact, not just the shape, look at the ridges and the way things fold under. Look at this area here. Now look at this, the brain stem that goes into the spinal column that delivers all those messages. Look how it kicks out. It's actually God's legs. Note the arm coming up here and then stopping. You have the arm coming over here, stopping right at the edge. Now it's going to continue on to give us the creation gesture. But even look at the crook of the elbow. Look at the crook of elbow. Where the crook of the elbow goes around, that's where Eve is. I'm going to need to bring in Eve, right? Because Adam is going to need a companion. And what's going to happen? Eventually, they're going to have children. Maybe this is one of their children. Maybe it's the Christ child later on for redemption because Eve is going to screw this up. That much we don't know, and that's speculated from the time period. But no, we are actually using a cross-section of the human brain as the mantle for Jesus, which is pretty remarkable in a place that does not allow anatomy. And so here's this kind of the spoof of that. So what's happening in this? In God's mind is all of human creation and development of the human brain, which separates us from the animal species. We are in the image of God. This is the divine moment of creation, the spark. It's the creation of the modern heroic male. It's odd that there's not a Garden of Eden, so to say. Very small genital, very small is unimportant. Relaxed mimics hand gestures. Look at the hand gestures that show up here. Even of the other individuals that's just outside the scene in different painting. Note, it basically mimics their hand gestures. And who are these? Most likely it's the Virgin Mary and either the first child from their coupling, Cain, who's eventually going to kill Abel. So really a consequence of the sin. Or alternatively, it might actually be Jesus to redeem the sin later on. Here's Michelangelo writing to his family about his arduous working conditions that he did not want, lying on his back, hanging upside down. We'll try this in class. It's actually rather miserable. I've grown a goiter by dwelling in this den. My beard turns up to heaven. My nape falls in. Fixed on my spine, my breastbone visibly bedews my face from brush drops thick and thin. My loins into my paunch like levers grind. My buttock like a crupper bears my weight. My feet unguided wander to and fro. And he goes through all the miserable aspects about how terrible this is, lying on the back, 60 feet in the air, constantly climbing up and down as he's going through it. He's got real problems with this, and he will walk with an off-kilter gait for the rest of his life because of this. Now, as we go through Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, we get to the central section. The center section with 4 before and 4 after. It's not the creation of man, which we would often associate and say that's where it should be. Remember, Michelangelo can choose anything he wants. He chooses to put this as the middle, the creation of Eve as the 5th panel. And the question for all of us to consider is that why would Michelangelo choose to put this as the 5th panel? And that really does become an interesting question as we move through. Well, first off, Eve. Note how she really does emerge out of Adam's rib. So it's very directly taken from the biblical passage. Now look at the gaze that happens here. Remember the loving gaze in the creation of Adam? Like God's created his highest creation. Here you are. He does not look happy at all about creating Eve. Look, he looks like he's almost bothered by the situation. And Eve's coming out literally in a prayer gesture, basically apologizing in some kind of capacities and praying to this almighty Father. And Adam can't be blamed. Adam's taking a nap. Note, the Garden of Eden is even worse now. So not only is it just rocks, now we've got dead trees. And here's the significant where Michelangelo reveals a little bit about why it's in the 5th panel. Note that dead tree, the symbolic function of it. Ooh, right here, that dead tree. Note it has the same exact form as Eve. It comes up. It shoots out at an angle. Note the exact same angle. It shoots out. Note there's the head. Here's the arms. And look at the fingers right here. See that finger gesture? That's the exact gesture as Eve. So what is Michelangelo trying to say? Eve causes dead things in the Garden of Eden. Or Eve is going to be responsible for the fall of man. Eve is going to be the temptress that eats the garden fruit, which of course Adam is going to do as well. So Eve, supposedly in the 5th, is the redeemer of life because she's the female. She's the one that's going to reproduce, that actually allows us to have children of Cain and Abel. But it's her evil that might cause the downfall of mankind. So the controversy here is, isn't it Eve that is really more important than Adam for humans? Adam's taking a nap while all this has happened, all in the Garden of Eden. So a very unusual depiction of Eve that is completely Michelangelo's invention here. Now, if we continue on the story of the Garden of Eden, and actually within the next section that shows up, this is actually the end of that next piece. So there's a first triptych, which is about Noah. There's the middle triptych, which is about the creation of Adam and Eve. This is the third aspect of that second triptych. So this is the culmination. You had Adam, now you have Eve, now you have the sin that's about to happen. Note, first off, look at Eve's body. That is ripped. Eve is a superhero bodybuilder. Giant musculature that shows up. She's got basically the same musculature as Adam. This, and we'll see this later on, causes some controversy because it does lend us into the idea here that what is going on? Is Eve and Adam, are they the same body? And this is because Michelangelo, when he actually can have the most beautiful women or the most beautiful men or both pose for him, he always only has male models pose for him. He never marries. As Jerry Seinfeld said in the Seinfeld episodes, he's neat, he's clean, he's organized. So it's led many individuals to speculate that they might be homosexual or asexual at the least. And so you'll notice he only uses male models. So that is a male body, basically with breasts slapped on. Note, the breasts don't even actually fall like that within it. You'll also note the dead thing that is in the exact same shape as Eve. As her hand bends back like this, you'll see the fingers outstretched. And note, Eve here gets a shout out. Eve, on some level, is being handed the apple, whereas Adam is plucking it himself. So, on some level, both Adam and Eve, for the first time in history, a new innovation by Michelangelo, are getting blamed for doing the temptation. And eventually, they're going to be kicked out into the garden. And so, they're going to be kicked out. Note when they kick out, his hair color changes, their body shape changes, and they go from being about 25 beautiful, wonderful people in the vibrancy of life. Adam is now well over 40. Eve even ages worse than that. And at least here we had hills. Now we're in a barren landscape that is just earth. That's kind of the idea. The fall of man is also the fall of woman. But even here, Eve gets a little bit more of the blame than men, but men are starting to get blamed as well. Now, here becomes one of the controversies that shows up. We have the devil horn hair that shows up here, showing that the evil is so bad that sin weighs us down. Adam and Eve are both going to get blamed. It's weird that it's happened in the Garden of Eden. Continuous narration, age, the sin weighs on you, so it changes your age. What about the oral sex potentially? This came up recently after the cleaning, and we saw more details about actually an individual that was giving tours named Dollinger in the Vatican himself. And now there are many people that believe this. Don't know if I want to make this assumption yet, but it is up there and it is in the literature. So if you do a fair amount of reading about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, this will most likely appear. And it comes out of a scholar named Dollinger. Dolinger is the first one. He was saying that in the Garden of Eden, look where Adam's butt would have been. His butt would have been right here, which means his crotch and that tiny little penis. And notice, the penis here is way more formed than the penis before. This would almost be the erect phallus or the erect penis. And so were they doing oral sex right beforehand? Now, the odd thing within this process is that oral sex would not have been a sin. Remember, they had one sin in the Garden of Eden. They were supposed to reproduce. They were supposed to have fun. They were supposed to enjoy the fruits of each other and everything else. Just don't take from the tree of knowledge, which is what they're doing right after the oral sex. So there might be this reference to sexuality also being one of the sins, even though in the Garden of Eden it was not. This is a continuous narration. Again, you have Adam and Eve continuing across the plain, very similar to we actually saw this earlier, narration like this being told in Mesopotamia, but really continuous narration, same figure here, comes out of ancient Egypt. So there is a reference here to earlier art as well from Michelangelo. If you look at the different body types, Michelangelo, as we talked about, we're going to move from the David image because he only used male bodies, and it's led some scholars to believe that he might be homosexual or asexual. So the male classical beauty, we're not going to change to this heroic male. The female body, we're going to change. No, we're not going to change. So even though we have the male body with basically stuck-on breasts, we're still going to stick with the more curvilinear, beautiful shape that we have of Aphrodite of Cnidus. So we're going to change the male body a little bit. We're going to have, again, penis size is not going to matter. Head size is still between 1/7 and 1/8, closer to 1/7. But we're going to give him 15 pounds more of upper body muscle to be our modern day hero. So we're going to go that. But for the female body, we're definitely not going to go there. And so this becomes the model of heroism that we have today. Still all the gender stereotypes come out of ancient Greece, but the larger muscular coming from Michelangelo in the Renaissance. Now, look at this figure here. That figure is a female figure. We know because look at the breast line. This is called the Cumaean Sibyl. Sibyl, remember, foretells the coming of Christ. Look how tiny her head is compared to her body. Clearly, she doesn't have that much rationale, that much logic coming out of the ancient Greek and Roman concepts. And so she's a Roman prophetess, and she foretold a coming Messiah, basically that Jesus would be coming. But note what's weird about this particular, and we see this in a couple different shapes. Note the hand gesture here. That hand gesture here is going to be controversial. That hand gesture that she's starting to make here, which is basically going to become this gesture that's going to develop, is a gesture that's called making the fig. And it's the most profane Renaissance gesture that we have. The reference is that we have the idea of when you are making this, It is something that's erect, basically the woman's clitoris that is opening up the vagina. But remember back then, they didn't talk about female sexuality. No one asked, no one cared. We're not going to care till much, much later in this class about women having an orgasm or enjoying sex in any kind of capacity. And so if you look at the bottom, even the Romans had the proverb about the fig. The most erotic thing a man can do is eat a fig naked, right? It kind of looks like the wet interior kind of, I guess, of a woman's vagina. And so it's the idea of kind of oral sex that it's playing out here. So here when a woman gets excited, that's the image that this hand starting to make, where the thumb actually comes in and gets tucked underneath, just with the opposite hand here. That basically is the equivalent of calling someone a pussy or referencing in a very negative connotation, that kind of aspect. That Sybil is exactly where the Pope walks in from his personal area of where he actually is into the Vatican. And so when the Pope walks in and is walking in to pray, he has to walk underneath this Sybil to basically be called this very crass version. Remember, and when we want to cut a man, we call him a female body part. We call him a vagina, or the C word that sometimes shows up in modern day language. The Romans did the exact same thing. Remember, this is the rebirth of the Roman world. So he only ever used male models. And so here is Cavalieri, which is an individual that Michelangelo worked with in response to a Michelangelo love poem that Michelangelo wrote. We do not know if the love poem was actually written specifically to Cavalieri, or it is a hint, though, of Michelangelo's sexual orientation. He says, "I swear to return your love. Never have I loved a man more than I love you." Now that could be brotherly love as well, filial love. "Never have I wished for a friendship more than I wish for yours." And so that's Cavalieri writing back to Michelangelo. And later on, and these are the first artworks that show up, are the Noah trilogy. Here they are right here, all the way on the left. Note, the figures are so much smaller. And so Pope Julius II, when Michelangelo was working on this, walked in, and ironically, when Michelangelo was working on Noah. I should mention, this is Noah's Ark. It's basically a floating houseboat, nothing like a boat today. Pope Julius II walked in when Michelangelo was working on this and criticized Michelangelo's early contention. Remember, he could ask them to redo all of them. He does not. And so we actually, in art history too, barely look at these except for the changes that happen. And he says they are too cluttered and unreadable. And so Michelangelo changed his later drawings to oversized, heroic dominant scenes where you have giant Adam and giant God and giant Eve. So you have limited figures. But that was probably a pretty good change. Like, this would work wonderfully in large scale painting on the wall where you're closer. But when you're 60 feet in the air, you kind of lose these images otherwise. And you can see. So this is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, a real remarkable feature. We're looking all the way up here. We're going to come back and actually look at the Last Judgment the next time I see you guys. And so why is the Sistine Chapel also awesome, particularly the ceiling? Well, it's Michelangelo's creation, and he's generally considered the greatest artist because of sculpture, not the greatest mind, that's Aristotle or Da Vinci, but the greatest artist. He learned fresco painting while making this, which is remarkable. The scale and difficulty in creating the artwork, he walks with a limp for the rest of his life. The extraordinary, beautiful draftsmanship of the figures. The trompe-l'oeil of the faux architecture. This is made to look like fake architecture, so you're looking up into the heavens. The emphasis on the humanity of Christ and God. He's going to popularize cartooning. Adam and Eve both get blamed, and he creates the modern heroic male figure. All of this in a project that takes about 4 years by an individual that actually hates to be a painter, wants to be a sculptor, and that's probably why we get the sculptural forms that are so beautiful within the artwork itself. I mean, they do look like they're chiseled out of marble, even from below. They really are quite beautiful. And so in class, what we're going to do is we're going to give you an opportunity to try to draw these figures. And you are going to draw, because Michelangelo is ambidextrous. Now remember, to be left-handed, they would actually teach you to draw right-handed. And they would actually tie your left hand up so that you had to draw right-handed. Michelangelo learns to draw with both hands. And the remarkable features, from what we can tell from his biography, he's the only artist that I know that's ever been able to do this. He can draw 2 different figures with his hands at the same time. So he literally can draw God and Adam at the same time using opposite hands, which is just a remarkably cool feature. And even if you ask your art professors, probably none of them will be able to do that very well either. Our brains are just not hardwired to do two things like that with two different mechanical functions at the same time. So this is from the first art historian Vasari. What a happy age we live in, and how fortunate are our craftsmen who have been given light and vision by Michelangelo. The glorias of achievement has won them all honor and renown, and shown them to distinguish the truth from falsehood that clouded their understanding. You artists should thank heaven for what has happened and strive to imitate Michelangelo in everything you do. It's just amazing. And here's his image for Pope Julius II's tomb, an image of Moses bringing the law. And so the artwork and the music behind us is by Palestrina, and so it's the Pope Marcellus March. And what it represents is the idea of counterpoint, where you have male and female voices playing in consort with one another. This is the style of music that Michelangelo, besides Gregorian chants, would have heard while he was working inside of the Sistine Chapel. And that will bring us to the end of Michelangelo. Even though we will see Michelangelo artwork in the next, we will actually see a separation as we go and look at the Last Judgment. Have a wonderful day, and I hope everyone is doing well. Bye.